Most mysteries begin with a crime. This one begins with a silence. On December 4th, 1872, the crew of the British brigantine De Gratia spotted a speck on the horizon 400 miles off the coast of the Azores. It was a ship, the Mary Celeste, drifting aimlessly under a pale Atlantic sun. There were no distress signals, no frantic waving from the deck. Just the slow, rhythmic creak of wood against water. When the boarding party climbed the side, they prepared themselves for a scene of horror. Pirates, a struggle, perhaps the aftermath of a plague. Instead, they found a scene of impossible, haunting order. The ship was perfectly seaworthy. In the galley, the remains of a meal sat on the table. In the captain's cabin, his young daughter's toys were still tucked into her bed. A sewing machine sat with a half-finished garment, the needle still poised to strike. 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol sat untouched in the hold. But the people, Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife Sarah, their 2-year-old daughter Sophia, and 7 seasoned sailors, were gone. No bloodstains, no signs of a fight. Just 10 souls who seemingly walked into the ocean and vanished into thin air. For over 150 years, the Mary Celeste has been the ultimate locked room mystery of the high seas. The world has blamed everything from giant squids and alien abductions to murderous mutinies and the Bermuda Triangle. But legends are often built on the bones of misunderstood facts. Today, we're putting aside the ghost stories. We're going back to the original 1872 court records, the chemical blueprints of the cargo, and the forensic physics of the ship's final hours. We aren't looking for monsters in the deep. We're looking for a series of small, mechanical failures that led to a single, fatal choice. This is the autopsy of a ghost ship. This is the invisible fist of the Mary Celeste.
To solve the riddle of the Mary Celeste, we first have to burn the legends. For over a century, the public was fed a diet of sensationalism. You've likely heard about the warm mugs of tea on the galley table, or the bloody sword found on the deck. These were the inventions of writers like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, fictions that became so embedded in history that they were eventually cited as fact. But the 1872 Gibraltar court records tell a much colder story. There was no half-eaten breakfast. The kitchen was a mess, tossed by the rough Atlantic swell. The blood on the sword was actually iron rust. The real mystery wasn't what was weird, it was what was missing. The first thing the boarding party from the De Gratia noticed wasn't supernatural. It was technical. The ship's only lifeboat was gone. It hadn't been ripped away by a storm. The tackle was coiled neatly, showing it had been lowered on purpose. And then, there were the tools of the trade. The captain's chronometer, the most vital clock on a ship, was missing. His sextant, used to find his position by the stars, was gone. His navigation charts were nowhere to be found. 10 people didn't vanish into thin air. They packed their essential gear and made a deliberate, calculated exit into a small, open boat in the middle of a vast ocean. For a master mariner like Benjamin Briggs to do that, he had to believe that staying on the Mary Celeste was a death sentence. But why? Why leave a 280-ton fortress for a tiny wooden rowboat? To find that answer, we have to look at what was happening beneath the floorboards. When the rescuers explored the hold, they found something the legends often overlook: a disassembled pump. One of the ship's primary life support systems had been stripped apart. For Captain Briggs, this was the first domino. He was sailing a ship that he believed was blind and drowning. But as we're about to see, the water wasn't the enemy. It was the air. The Mary Celeste wasn't just a ship. It was a complex machine. And by late November 1872, that machine was starting to fail. To understand why Captain Briggs made the decision to abandon his vessel, we have to look at the intersection of two critical failures. One was navigational, and the other was structural. The first failure was the clock. In the 19th century, a ship's chronometer was its eyes. It allowed the captain to calculate longitude, his exact position east or west. If that clock was even slightly off, the ship was effectively lost. Modern forensic reconstruction of the Mary Celeste's route suggests that Briggs' chronometer was failing. Analysis of his last log entries compared to actual weather patterns at the time shows he was roughly 120 miles off course. He believed he was nearing the safety of the Azores, but in reality, he was still trapped in the deep, unpredictable waters of the Atlantic. While Briggs struggled with his position, a second, more dangerous problem was brewing under his feet. The Mary Celeste had recently undergone a major refit in New York, where it had been heavily loaded with coal. We now know that coal dust and debris are the natural enemies of a ship's bilge pumps. This debris settles at the very bottom of the hull, forming a thick, gritty sludge that can clog the intake valves. When the rescuers boarded the ship, they found 3.5 feet of water in the hold. To a casual observer, that sounds like a lot, but for a ship of that size, it was manageable. Unless you couldn't pump it out. The sight of that disassembled pump on the deck tells a story of a crew fighting a losing battle. They were pumping. The pumps were failing, and with the cargo of 1,700 barrels of alcohol blocking their view, they had no way to know if the ship was taking on a few inches of water or a few feet. Briggs was flying blind. His ship was seemingly taking on water, and he was 120 miles from where his charts told him he should be. He was a man backed into a corner by his own equipment. But the water in the hold wasn't what finally broke his resolve. It was the cargo. 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol were about to turn the Mary Celeste from a struggling ship into a floating bomb. While the crew struggled with the pumps, a silent chemical transformation was occurring within the belly of the ship. The Mary Celeste was carrying a cargo that was as lucrative as it was lethal. 1,701 barrels of denatured industrial alcohol. This wasn't the kind of alcohol you find on a bar shelf. It was a volatile, high-proof chemical bound for the factories of Italy. When the ship was later inspected in Gibraltar, investigators found something peculiar. 9 of the barrels were empty. Upon closer examination, it was discovered that these specific barrels were made of red oak, while the others were white oak. Red oak is far more porous, a structural flaw that allowed the ethanol to seep through the wood and vaporize into the air of the tightly sealed cargo hold. As the ship sailed through the varying temperatures of the Atlantic, that vapor began to expand. In the darkness of the hold, the air became thick with a highly combustible gas. It didn't take much. A small spark from a metal tool, a lantern, or even static electricity to ignite the cloud. Modern forensic experiments conducted at University College London have finally solved the mystery of why the ship showed no signs of a fire. Using a scale model of the Mary Celeste's hold, scientists triggered a flash explosion of ethanol vapor. The result was what they called an invisible fist. It was a massive, high-pressure blast of blue flame that roared through the ship, blowing hatch covers off their hinges and sending a shockwave through the timber. Because ethanol burns so quickly and at such a specific temperature, the flame was gone in less than a second. It didn't have enough time to char the wood or leave behind soot. To the crew on deck, it would have been a terrifying, deep boom that shook the entire vessel, followed by the sight of heavy hatch covers flying into the air. To Captain Briggs, This wasn't just a leak, it was the final warning. He believed the ship was about to explode into 1,000 pieces. He didn't know that the invisible fist had already spent its energy. In his mind, every second they stayed on board was a second closer to a catastrophic fire. He had to get his wife, his daughter, and his men away from the cargo hold immediately. It was in this moment of peak adrenaline and fear that the fatal order was given. The decision was made in a heartbeat. Briggs didn't intend to abandon the Mary Celeste forever. He intended to survive the next 10 minutes. He ordered the crew to lower the yaw, the ship's small single lifeboat. They moved with the frantic precision of men who believed the floor was about to melt beneath them. They grabbed the essentials, the chronometer, the sextant, and the navigation charts. But they left the food, the water, and their personal belongings. This was meant to be a temporary refuge. To ensure they wouldn't be separated from their only home, they tied a 3-inch thick manila tow line to the Mary Celeste and lowered themselves into the rising swells of the Atlantic. They would trail behind at a safe distance, waiting for the explosive vapors to clear before climbing back aboard. But the Atlantic is not a place for temporary plans. As the 10 souls sat in the tiny, overcrowded boat tethered to the 280-ton brigantine, the weather shifted. A sudden, violent squall, a common occurrence near the Azores, swept across the water. A massive gust of wind caught the Mary Celeste's foresails, which were still set and drawing wind. The main ship lunged forward with the weight of 1,000 storms. The tow line, 400 feet of heavy rope, snapped taut like a violin string. Under the immense pressure of the moving ship, the line groaned, frayed, and finally, it snapped. In that single, sickening moment, the link was severed. The Mary Celeste, now a ghost ship in earnest, began to sail away from its creators. The crew would have watched in absolute, paralyzed horror as their fortress, the only thing holding food, water, and safety, pulled away into the fog at 5 knots. In an open boat, lost in a rising sea with no way to catch a sailing ship, the struggle was over before it began. When the Dea Gratia found the vessel 10 days later, the silence they encountered was the final echo of that snapped rope. The Mary Celeste didn't keep its secret. It simply outlived the people who knew the truth. The Mary Celeste never outran its reputation. Over the next 13 years, it changed hands 17 times, eventually becoming a hoodoo ship that no sailor wanted to touch. Its journey ended in 1885, wrecked on a reef off Haiti in a botched insurance fraud. A messy end for a ship that once held the world's most pristine mystery. But the real tragedy wasn't the timber, it was the legacy left behind. Arthur Briggs, the 7-year-old son waiting in Massachusetts, spent his life in the shadow of a horizon that swallowed his entire world. He eventually went to sea himself, perhaps searching for the parents and sister he lost, only to perish in a shipwreck of his own years later. We want to believe in giant squids and ghosts because they give the crew a fight. But the truth is colder. The Mary Celeste was a victim of a series of small mechanical betrayals: a clogged pump, a faulty clock, and a porous barrel. It remains a reminder that on the open ocean, the line between survival and legend is only as thick as a single manila rope. The ghost ship wasn't haunted by spirits. It was haunted by a series of choices made in total darkness. The Atlantic didn't take their lives with a roar. It took them with a silence that still echoes today.